All right, but we will get going. So good morning, or I suppose afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Malaika Almi. I'm with the Geological Survey of Canada of Natural Resources Canada, and I'm coming to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation, and I would like to recognize the history of colonialism on the lands we all find ourselves today, the privilege that comes with that, and the need for change in our society. And I think we are all here for positive change, as this is the second seminar in the Understanding Risk BC event, bringing together actors across society who are working towards resilience. I hope some of you enjoyed last week's session on equity in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. If not, the session was recorded and it's available now on the session webpage. This session is understanding the economic impacts of disasters and economic resilience. And before we get going, I'd just like to provide some information on the format for today. We are using the Zoom webinar module. So that means participants are all on mute and can't see each other, so it's a bit impersonal. It's hard to know who else is attending. But we do encourage you to participate using the chat function. Also, as you have questions throughout, please post your questions in a Q&A. You can direct them to a particular speaker as you like, or leave them generally for response. Also, you can like each other's questions, and we will try to deal with those first that have been seen as most relevant and liked by the most participants. There will be a Q&A for our keynote speaker following his presentation, and then another general Q&A towards the end. So please participate actively, share your thoughts, experiences, questions, because this is how we can engage, is through the functions of Zoom. So please use the chat and use the Q&A. Now, with a big thank you to Sahar Safai for organizing the session and bringing us together, I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, we've got Paul Kovacs, the founder and executive director for the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction at the University of Western Ontario. You have probably seen his name in print, as he has more than 200 publications to his name, including a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, and he's a distinguished commentator on all things insurance, disaster safety, climate change, and economic policy. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Adam Rose. Adam is a researcher and the director of the Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events in the Price School of Public Safety at the University of Southern California. His work focuses on the economic consequence analysis of natural and man-made hazards and on economic resilience, as well as on energy and climate change policy. He's led reports to Congress on the benefits of mitigation grants, was the lead on a number of studies to estimate the economic consequences of 9/11, as you'll see in his presentation. And he's currently working on studies of the macroeconomic impacts of COVID-19. So with many publications to his name as well, Adam has been recognized for his work with the IDRIM Distinguished Research Award, Regional Economic Models Outstanding Economic Analysis Award, Applied Technology Council Outstanding Achievement Award, the American Planning Association's Outstanding Program Planning Honor Award, the East-West Center Fellowship, and the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. So thank you so much to both of you for being here. I should have advanced the slide too, so you can see who it is that I'm talking about. But we will start with Paul to set the context. So Paul Kovacs is going to provide some background on economic impacts of disasters and resilience in Canada and give us a bit of a preview of what we'll hear today. So Paul, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to you. If you can unmute, you're on mute there. Paul, you're still on mute.
Okay, there we go.
Great.
It was
Thank
hidden
you.
from me. Malika, thank you for those kind words of introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Everybody, thank you for making the time to join this session. For everybody who's involved in work about understanding risk and those involved in disaster risk reduction, your work is really important. I'm excited to have an opportunity to speak with you, and I'm really pleased that you are making the time to work in this important field. So thank you. I'm going to spend, as Malika said, about 5 minutes just to set the context. Adam Rose is our keynote today, and he'll give you the main presentation. But quickly, in 5 minutes, just some context for the conversation. Measurement of the impact and analysis of resilience is an important dimension to understand so we can reduce disaster risk. My good friend Adam Rose is going to be our keynote today. Dr. Rose will share some of his pioneering work to develop comprehensive measures of the impact of disasters, including both direct and indirect damage. Adam will also speak about tools he's developed for decision makers to assess the benefits and the cost of taking action to reduce or to improve resilience. And my role is to set the context. After Adam speaks, I'll come back and just share a couple of my thoughts, especially about how some of these ideas apply in the Canadian context. Leaders from the international business community meet for a week in Davos, Switzerland every January. This is the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. Political leaders and some academics are also invited to participate. The week begins with the release of the updated Global Risk Report. I really encourage everybody to take a look at the Global Risk Report. It's available to download. It's a very interesting read. It's been available for the last 15 years now. It presents the results of a survey of about 1,000 people from the business community and some opinion leaders. And it asks about 30 risks around the world. What's the likelihood that the risk will be evident over the next 10 years? And how severe will the consequences be if that risk does occur? They generate a risk map, and the risk map is used to discuss what are the priorities, what should society be focusing on first and foremost going forward. For the last 4 years, the business leaders around the world have identified extreme weather as the top global risk. And over the last 7 years, it was the first or the second highest risk in the world in terms of likelihood. The definition the World Economic Forum used to describe extreme weather is major property, infrastructure, and/or environmental damage, as well as loss of life caused by extreme weather events. So this is the top risk in the world, according to the world's business leaders. And that's what we're talking about today, understanding risk. There has been a remarkable increase in damage resulting from flooding, wildfires, severe weather, other extreme events. And these losses are going to get worse until we start to change our behavior and improve our resilience. Rising losses are evident in Canada and around the world, and it's important that we do better. Beyond this global and national conversation about where disaster risk or severe weather risk fits into the overall agenda, and the answer is near the top, is a framework for what to do. So the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction sets out a comprehensive plan so we can improve our resilience to hazards. The framework's been adopted by the Government of Canada, it was adopted by British Columbia, as BC is modernizing its emergency management practices. And the framework is built around 4 priorities for action: understand risk, strengthen disaster risk governance, invest in risk reduction, and plan to build resilience and recovery. Breaking the trend of rising loss and damage begins with better understanding of risk. That's why we're meeting today. That's the point of this series of discussions. The focus for many years was understanding hazards. What was the risk of water reaching a certain level, of having an earthquake, of having a wildfire? The shift internationally and here for our conversation has moved from understanding hazard to understanding risk. What's the risk of loss and damage? And what can we do about it? A part driven by, sometimes there's nothing you can do about the hazard, but we can still reduce the risk that a hazard results in loss and damage. And to do that, Adam's going to talk about some of his work to measure loss and damage. How we go beyond looking at hazard to looking at risk involves understanding, measuring and understanding loss and damage. Loss and damage includes direct damage. We're having a lot of buildings and infrastructure that are being damaged by extreme events. For example, in Fort McMurray, there were more than 2,500 homes that were destroyed. But The broader conversation also talks about a community that was evacuated for a month, an incredible hardship for homeowners and businesses that were interrupted. Measurement of direct and indirect impacts is essential to help decision makers to better understand and to take action to reduce disaster risk. So it's really important that we confront and break this alarming global trend of rising loss and damage resulting from natural hazards. Comprehensive measurements of the consequences of extreme events can be contrasted with the cost of possible mitigative actions to develop pathways to improve our resilience to future risk. I'm really excited that Dr. Rose is going to speak today about some of the practices and actions that he's developed to help measure the impact and to allow us to better assess the merits of resilient alternatives going forward. Later, I'll come back and share some of my thoughts. Malika, I had a few words to introduce Dr. Rose. Would you like me to do that, Malika, or are you going to say more about Dr. Rose?
Well, I provided a bit of an intro, so I think we've got that covered off.
Wonderful. So thank you for the opportunity to frame the conversation. I just want to share with everybody, thank you for the work you are doing involving understanding risk and promoting risk reduction. It's really important. Global efforts, Canadian efforts, put this really high on the agenda of things that we need to do even better. And Dr. Rose is going to help us with some of the specifics. Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Thanks so much, Paul. That was a great way to get the juices flowing, help us understand the global and Canadian context, and provide some background for the discussion. So again, I'm going to ask people, please go ahead and share your thoughts in the chats, but we're going to move on to our keynote from Adam Rose. There will be a Q&A following that. And then hopefully we'll squeeze in a very short break and then continue with the session. So Adam, thanks again so much for being here. Please go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, well, first I wanted to say I'm happy to be here today virtually and to thank Sahar and Murray for inviting me and for coordinating this effort. So let me share my screen here and get this on
Great.
Slideshow mode.
Perfect.
And so the title of my talk is Economic Consequences of and Resilience to Disasters. And to some of you, those might kind of be buzzwords or academic jargon. So the first one, consequences, I'm going to be focusing on a subset of consequences that we refer to as business interruption in everyday language, and on one risk reduction approach referred to as resilience, and a special interpretation of resilience in terms of things you can do to reduce losses once the disaster strikes. So the business interruption just begins when the disaster hits and continues until you've recovered, and there are all kinds of things one business can do and household can do to reduce those losses. And essentially then we can translate resilience into a counterpart of business continuity. So to begin, there's been a major shift in the natural hazard loss estimation paradigm. The focus has shifted to an emphasis on the flow of goods and services emanating from property or the capital stock. So it's not the capital stock or property itself that adds to people's well-being directly, it's the goods and services that are produced and that they consume. So this flow of goods and services is typically measured in terms of GDP or employment, and often referred to as business interruption or BI. And as I mentioned a minute ago, BI just begins at the point when the disaster strikes and continues until an entity is recovered. And thus business interruption is actually more complicated in many ways than addressing property damage, because it includes behavioral considerations in terms of human reactions to the disaster, not just buildings that really can't react in any sophisticated way once the disaster is struck, and also policy considerations with regard to things like government assistance and recovery planning. Business interruption has become increasingly prominent in many domains. For years, if one goes back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, news accounts would typically report on disasters in terms of the amount of property damage alone. And I've been heartened to see the last dozen years or so them also reporting things like GDP losses, loss of sales revenue, again, which represent business interruption. And moreover, business interruption has become very prominent for major disasters. So in terms of the September 11 World Trade Center attacks, property damage was on the order of 25 billion, but business interruption was more than 4 times that amount. Hurricane Katrina, the property damage, these are all in 2007 dollars, by the way. Hurricane Katrina, property damage was on the order of 75 billion, but partly because it took so long to recover, business interruption as well exceeded 100 billion. And some of you are probably familiar with the shakeout San Andreas fault earthquake scenario that the US Geological Survey undertook. There, the property damage estimate was on the order of 100 billion, and BI was not greater, but a very significant amount. So let me talk a little bit about the motivation for loss estimation modeling in the first place. And the first question to ask is, in what context are ex-ante economic loss evaluations useful? Basically simulating a potential or scenario event. And these are important where events are infrequent and data are sparse. In other words, you have very little historical information, and so simulations and the types of analyses I do primarily can be very valuable in that sense. Some of my analyses are such as my studies on the impacts of 9/11 were after the fact and help calibrate these models and validate them. How should these studies be undertaken? And in what form? So they're best when they're standardized across disasters, so you have a better basis of comparison. And another thing to keep in mind is we have a range of models at our disposal. I'll be talking about 1 or 2 types, but there's no one best model that fits all, and a lot depends on the accuracy you need and the data you have at hand. So another question is, how can ex-ante evaluations complement the gathering of ex-post economic loss data? Well, these simulation exercise provide a useful framework for analysis and data collection, and their simulation results can fill in some gaps in available data. Another issue is the collection of ex-post data still necessary with the increasing precision of ex-ante economic modeling? In other words, well, we don't want to make too big a thing out of these ex-ante analyses. It doesn't mean we have to stop collecting data or analyzing what happened after the fact. And the two are most effective when put together and where these ex-ante analyses serve as validation checks. So this is an overview of my presentation today. I'm basically going to be talking about a broad economic consequence analysis framework, which is imperative for accuracy. In other words, you want to include all the major elements that have been refined in terms of methodology and consideration in recent years. And I'm going to focus primarily on the first 3: resilience, extreme behavioral responses, and complex supply chain linkages. But remediation can be an important consideration. If you want to do a full benefit cost analysis, you'd also include mitigation and various spillover effects. So an overview then is I'm going to start with the presentation of the CREATE economic consequence analysis framework and provide some example applications in terms of these 3 major considerations of expanded consequence analysis from old traditional impact analysis, talk about a few case studies, and then show you 2 pieces of software that my research teams and I have developed. One of them is called ECAT, the Economic Consequence Analysis Tool, that is a decision support tool to give you quick estimates of the business interruption impacts of a range of disasters, and the business resilience calculator, which is actually intended to be used by individual businesses to do a self-assessment of their resilience capability, and also to be able to compare it to what other businesses like them are doing and get on a road to improving their resilience capability. Just a check. Can everybody hear me all right? Malika? Are
Yes,
we okay?
loud and clear. Thank you.
All right. So this is a diagram of the Create Economic Consequence Analysis Framework. Can you see my cursor on this screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So we start with a disaster event scenario, and the old traditional approach of economic impact analysis would typically then, as Paul mentioned, look at some economic impacts beyond just the physical damage, and usually that was just property damage. Sometimes loss of life would be considered, and both of these might be fed into some kind of further analysis. But what the first advance was to go beyond the property damage and to consider business interruption, which basically takes place on site, and then there are indirect consequences or further negative impacts due to multiplier or general equilibrium effects. Loss of life is factored in terms of the reduction in the labor force or labor participation rates in a more sophisticated manner these days as well. So the first major advance in this area beginning in the late 1990s was to consider resilience. And by resilience, just a quick definition, this is basically a way you can mute losses once the disaster has struck. And we've found it's especially powerful and in many cases has the potential to mute those business interruption losses by 50 to 75%. On the other hand, behavioral linkages work in the opposite direction. They typically refer to overreactions stemming from fear. Examples would be 9/11, where it turned out the major factor influencing the overall results was the almost 2-year reduction in airline travel and related tourism because people were afraid to get on an airplane. And so these can be quite complex and need to be factored in. And both of them actually have ordinary and direct consequences as well. And we put these together and we come up with a more comprehensive estimate of total economic impacts. So I'm not, in the interest of time, not going to focus on the things on the right-hand side. In a benefit cost analysis, essentially, the benefits are the avoided losses. So all of this is to evaluate the losses, and you just put that's a minus sign. You translate those into benefits or avoided losses. You compare those to mitigation costs, sometimes remediation costs, and able to perform a benefit cost analysis. So why is this important to capture all these factors? Well, one of the insights is that they vary so greatly between different types of disasters. So one really has to drill down into a disaster-specific analysis. So here we've got 5 biothreats: a stadium attack with some bioterrorist device, attack on an urban center, an airport, foot and mouth disease, or just water service. And you can see they vary in terms of their total effect, but they also vary in terms of the individual components. So the loss of life in a stadium in a bio attack would be enormous because people are really concentrated. The ordinary business interruption would be fairly minimal in terms of the lost revenue on that site, but the behavioral linkages extend beyond that site, and that may lead to cancellation of sporting events for months. And hence you get that fairly large number. Resilience there is people spending money on something else, so it's not a total drain on the economy, and you have that result. In terms of an airport attack, you can have a huge loss of 220 billion due to banning airline travel or just the fear factor alone. But the resilience here refers to intermodal shifts where people drive more, take the trains, and find other ways to spend their vacation money. And I don't need to go through all of these, but you can see the variation across types of attacks and across various consequence categories. So let me begin by something many of you are familiar with. This is the Insurance Bureau of Canada study in 2013. First bullet is the title. The purpose was really to raise awareness and provide a valuable tool for governments and various stakeholders. And I had the honor with my colleague Dan Way and colleague Mike Lahr to do the economic impact analysis. And this was Ontario, Quebec, 7.1 magnitude earthquake, which we estimated would lead to $61 billion of business interruption losses. The British Columbia, larger earthquake, but smaller overall population affected, 75 billion. And 40% of Canada's population resides in these two zones, and hence the report referred to a domino effect nationally, which we referred to as supply chain or multiplier or general equilibrium effects in economic parlance. This is one of the tables from the report, and with, it shows you the vectors of the individual business interruption losses, and building damage is the largest proportion. As I recall, it's on the order of 87% of the total. And so that's without resilience. And then if we go to total impacts with resilience, that number is reduced considerably by about 80%, in fact. The one thing we found over the years is that my earlier studies were overly optimistic in that we're really talking about potential resilience, but the real world always has obstacles and impediments to implementing any policy or any action, and resilience is no exception. So we essentially split the difference and said, well, what if resilience is only about 50% of its potential? Then you have these total output impacts, business interruption impacts going down to about 12.7 billion. So it turns out that you can reduce these initial losses of 21 billion in our projection down to 12.7 billion with the implementation of resilience. Here's another example of how all of this fits together and how one can make some important distinctions. The standard approach, and I think I may have, let's see, yeah, one of my slides disappeared, but this is a 90-day disruption for Port Arthur, Port Beaumont complex in Texas, where a standard estimate of the losses is 1.3 billion for a 90-day disruption. And the standard estimate is often just the revenue that the port receives or would have received during the outage. But if we take into account the value of all those imported products to customers and their likelihood of having to shut down, if in fact there is this disruption, it balloons up to 14.8 billion. But then again, if we apply resilience, we're able to reduce that number. But you can see the difference in those three numbers depending on how comprehensive an analysis you perform. And one of the points I'll make as we go along is that resilience represents a relatively low cost way of reducing risk or reducing business interruption. So a background on economic resilience. There are two major perspectives these days. Engineers typically prefer the perspective that says it should refer to everything you do to reduce losses pre and post the disaster. And the focus is really on mitigation of property damage. And so I've always thought, well, there's a perfectly good word for what you do ahead of time, and that's mitigation. We haven't had such a good term for what you do afterwards. So why not confine resilience to that? And mind you, the origin of the word resilience, the Latin, means to bounce back, not to prevent in the first place, but essentially to recover. At the same time, we acknowledge that resilience is a process. Things can be done in advance to build resilience capacity. You can undertake emergency drills, put backup generators in place, line up alternative suppliers, stockpile critical inputs. However, these are not implemented until after the disaster hits. So the latter perspective here may strike some as odd. How can you reduce property damage post-disaster? Well, you can't, but that's just one measure. But if you consider business interruption, then there are a lot of things you can do. So I've been studying resilience for 25 years before it was cool. And I've studied it in about 10 different disciplines: ecology, engineering, planning, organizational behavior, sociology. And I've actually found more commonalities than differences, despite the fact that there are now dozens, if not more than 100 definitions out there. And so what I've presented here is a general definition of resilience, and that you find common to most of those disciplines, and more specific economic counterpart. And so the general definition, going back to Buzz Holling, who's kind of considered the father of modern resilience analysis in the 70s, who's an ecologist, the ability of a system to maintain function when shocked. So to an economist, this is the efficient use of remaining resources at a given point in time to produce as much as possible. And so this relates to economics as the science of scarcity, and it's not just rebounding, but trying to do so in the least cost manner. And the point here is that you find yourself with even more scarce resources in the aftermath of a disaster that you need to deal with. Most of my analysis today is going to be on static economic resilience, so I'm just going to talk about dynamic for a moment. It's really all about the ability and speed of a system to recover. An ecologist named Pym, this is attributable for the most part to his definition. And in this case, we're talking about the efficient use of resources over time for investment in repair and reconstruction. And that's still another important area of research and work I've done. And I've got some references in the back to refer you to some of this work as well. But the bottom line is the metric that I put forth about 16 years ago suggested a good way to measure resilience is to take the averted or prevented losses from implementing a resilience tactic and dividing it by the maximum potential losses. And to get down to some cases, we've been talking about resilience in a nebulous way, but at the micro level for the individual business, here's a set of 11 resilience tactics or actions. So conservation, the typical definition, resource isolation is modifying a portion of your business operations to run without a critical input. Most all of these relate to coping with some disruption of the business of one of its critical inputs. And in COVID-19, ironically, the most critical input is workers. Which is often different than most other kinds of disasters. So most of these are self-explanatory: inventories or stockpiling, technological change. Production recapture is the one that refers primarily to the output side, and this refers to making up lost production by working overtime or extra shifts following the disaster. And if, for instance, you have an electricity outage or COVID-19, you don't have property damage, you don't have to wait for the rebuilding. As soon as the power comes back on, as soon as people feel comfortable about going back to work, there's no reason that you can't undertake this tactic by those mechanisms I mentioned. And the cost of this is paying overtime to workers. Some of these tactics, as I said, are low cost. Conservation often pays for itself by being able to do more with less. Inventories is really just the carrying cost of the inventories, not the total value of the inventories. Management effectiveness is pretty inexpensive as well. And I might also say that we also make a distinction between inherent and adaptive. Some of these types of resilience tactics are built into the system, such as the ability to substitute inputs or excess capacity. And others are what we call adaptive, and they're improvised after the fact. So you undertake more conservation than you thought possible by turning down the air conditioning in the summer and saving on electricity, or winding up improvising something in your technology to be able to be more productive, or changing your management structure. So an example of the metric, and one of the tactics, relates to the World Trade Center attack. So a dozen years ago, I had the honor of coordinating 8 studies, including one of my own, to analyze what the impacts of the World Trade Center attacks were on GDP of the New York area and the US. And it turns out that 95% of the over 1,100 World Trade Center area firms relocated after 9/11. They didn't just fold up. And if all the firms in the World Trade Center would have gone out of business, the direct business interruption loss would have been $58.4 billion. If they all would have relocated immediately, then there wouldn't have been any business interruption losses. But it took most firms an average of 2 to 4 months to really relocate and get back up and running. And so the actual BI loss was 16.1. So the avoided loss divided the maximum potential loss. The avoided loss is 58.4 minus 16.1, or 42.3, and you divide that by the maximum potential, and you get that metric of 72%. In other words, 72% of the potential losses from the World Trade Center attack were in fact avoided, prevented by this relocation tactic. Behavioral linkages is another category of consequences that are rather new in terms of their conceptualization and their measurement, and it pretty much refers to off-site responses associated with behavioral changes on the part of businesses, households, investors, and workers. Typically emanates from the social amplification of risk and stigma effects through media coverage and rumor. Fear feeds on itself and spreads, and it translates itself into both direct and indirect business interruption losses. And behavioral impacts can increase losses by 2 to 3 orders of magnitude. And examples are, I mentioned that the large part of the potential losses from the World Trade Center attacks were prevented by relocation, but of the remaining business interruption losses of over 100 billion, more than 80% of those losses were due to the 2-year reduction in airline travel and related tourism. For a study we did on a dirty bomb attack in the financial district of Los Angeles, we found that those behavioral impacts were 15 times the ordinary impacts that people typically estimate, because employees would demand a higher wage because of the increased risk of going back to an area they thought was contaminated. Businesses might have to provide discounts. If you were a restaurant and wanted to bring people back, chances are you'd have to provide some kind of discount on your food services, and investors would likely require an increased rate of return. So all of those cause a much greater negative economic impact in terms of business interruption. These are some other examples of behavioral linkages. Workers fearing riding the subway, businesses fear of staying open after dark, investor fears of taking risks, general avoidance behavior, which in our case now is people's fear of sending their kids back to school. And even things like government's premature shutdowns or evacuations in anticipation of disasters, which essentially can cause severe business interruption. Everybody still hear me okay? Okay. Yeah. So the next thing I want to talk about is the economic consequence analysis tool, abbreviated by ECAT. And the purpose here was to develop a standardized capability to estimate economic consequences of over 30 types of threats. And thus far, we've got it calibrated to be able to do about 10. So this includes a comprehensive set of impact categories, such as the ones I've talked about, and also a standardization that can facilitate comparison, especially when you want to make major resource allocation decisions. So essentially, this is based on a lot of research for many years where we transitioned it to a user-friendly, quick turnaround software tool for high-level decision makers they can use for risk management decisions in terms of how to allocate dollars across multiple threats, both in terms of promoting resilience, but also for mitigation purposes as well, and also used for rapid response where one needs a quick estimate of how much it will take to remediate after disaster, provide assistance, or engage in recovery. And at the bottom, I've mentioned 3 former postdocs that were major contributors and co-authors of this ECAT study. And again, the last slide I'll present, I'm sure the slide deck will be posted, has a reference to this. You can probably Google this pretty readily as well. So this is the ECAT user interface. And here we have the 9 types of threats, 3 in the terrorism area, 3 natural, 3 technological accidents, even though sometimes something like a maritime cyber disruption can obviously be caused by an intentional act. And so the user simply needs to click on to which of these 9 threats is of interest, and the type of uncertainty display. Is a point estimate sufficient, or would you need an interval or entire distribution of potential losses? And then just click go and you get a screen which would provide you the initial results. This is a default one, and the purple areas essentially connote the fact that we haven't filled in any of these parameter values. It's just gone to the default internally into the software. And then some things are essentially not applicable in some of these cases. And actually, I have that backwards. It's been a while since then. So the purples are things that are sort of less impactful, and the resilience are the things that you want to include if you're focusing on resilience alone. There's a drop down list here which will define each of these terms in terms of the tactic, and if in fact you click on them and impart some resilience to this event, you'd come up with the next screen. But just for starters, the GDP loss for the nation from this cyber threat is on the order of $121 billion and 257,000 jobs. If in fact we talk about resilience in terms of ship rerouting, able to reroute the ships who can't get into a given port by rerouting another port and undertaking production there, or rerouting it overland, you can reduce those losses by about 1/3, down to about 81.23 billion overall. The magnitude of the event is the primary factor affecting its the initial impact. So it's the billions of dollars of trade that's lost as a direct measurement for the event, and the user puts in whatever number is appropriate for their maritime disruption, and go through the various types of resilience options that you have, and fill in more than just one. I've done this in a comparative static mode just to isolate resilience. And again, these other factors are of less importance in coming up with the outcome. For instance, duration is really subsumed within this total amount of trade that is restricted. Another software tool is the Business Resilience Calculator, and this is based on survey results, and in the future will be based on real-time updates by users. And this measures not just the effectiveness that we've talked about in terms of the metric, but the cost effectiveness, what the cost is per unit of percent reduction in losses. And this helps solve the thorny issue of weights in compiling a resilience index. And so essentially what the user does is performs a self-assessment of their own resilience capability, and the resilience calculator provides some default numbers for them that would represent how firms similar to them have an outcome with regard to resilience, what their resilience score is, basically in terms of benefit cost ratio, and also provides a comparison with best practice firms in their industry. And then firms can set targets for resilience improvement, and there are some guidelines in the BRC, some links to various sources of financial assistance primarily, or information assistance from the government. We're going to expand that to philanthropic organizations, and ways the government can help in this. And again, I want to acknowledge my co-author Noah Dormady and the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute as sponsoring this important research. So this is what we call the landing page, and we've just come out with kind of a demo version of the Business Resilience Calculator oriented toward COVID-19, and the landing page gives you more information below this, but one would simply click on Start Using the BRC Now, and the next page that would come up would be a list of resilience tactics. And essentially you would, if you were a business manager or owner, click on those that you have at your disposal. If you're a little bit unsure of their meaning, there's a definition, and it asks you whether implementing them incurs the cost or saves you money. And this is different than, when I say saves, different than preventing losses. This is, does the very implementation save you money? So some things like buying a backup generator are going to cost you money, but conservation, like I say, finding a way to do more with less actually saves you money in the implementation side, as well as in preventing business interruption. And then one basically hits the Calculate Now button, and you get these results in terms of some of your resilience tactics ranked according to which is likely to reduce the most disruption, not necessarily the highest benefit cost ratio, but essentially it gives you the default. Typical firms like yours avoided $6.98 US dollars for every dollar spent on this tactic. For all firms in your sector more broadly, it was lower, but there are best practice, best performer firms that are able to do more than twice as good as the median. And the same thing goes for conservation. And this screen basically cuts off the bottom, but if you had 6 resilience tactics, you were going to note you could, in fact, it'll show you the rest. So Malika, I recall that I think I promised I might break up the presentation a little bit. And I guess it is getting a little bit late now, but I guess we're at maybe about the 35-minute mark.
Yeah, you got 5 more minutes.
Questions now or just finish up?
I think if you can finish up in around 5 minutes, keep going.
Okay, all right. So here's another port disruption example I did with another 2 former postdocs for a hit on the Port of LA and Long Beach, really through a severe event that would call for a long-term outage of the port. And I might say in terms of port-related resilience tactics, most of the work on resilience that I've done and the resilience calculator, it really relates to the customer of, let's say, electric utilities or other businesses. What a business can do to cope with the input supply disruption. For the port, we looked at both the customer side in terms of these resilience options that I've talked about before, but also the supplier side, the port itself. So there are various ways the port can be resilient in anticipation of a shutdown in terms of excess capacity, ship rerouting if the port's done, or if you have limited capacity, you can prioritize certain cargoes, and the loss estimation we do can differentiate according to the losses according to different cargoes, not only direct use but the supply chain use. You can divert exports for import use, and again, recapture lost production on the supplier side as well. And so here we're talking about a large-scale tsunami, and in this case, shutting down that port for 1 year and having the entirety of the import and export supply chains disrupted. This is kind of spaghetti diagram of how complicated this can be in terms of the various considerations. The tsunami hits, you've got a closure of the entire port. You've got downtime at individual terminals. You'd want to break it into that, and you also would want to consider cargo damages, and each of those fit into microeconomic impacts. You've got the supply side resilience in the sort of light blue gray color, and then they fit into macroeconomic impacts primarily on the customer side. And so you have these tan resilience capabilities, and all of these calculations have to take place, and you wind up getting the macro impact. So I've talked a lot about what our analysis can do. One thing we really haven't done is what are the long run impacts of an event like this or some of the others. And one of the things port operators have found is it is often difficult to recover. Kobe is a good example. Once businesses or shippers shift to another port and realize that that's an option, they don't always return to their initial intended port. So we come up short on this long run impacts, but there are a lot of capable people out there that can do that kind of analysis. Or there are numbers one can adapt from the literature to do that kind of analysis. We use the term model, and without getting into the fine points of the model, the point is it's these models that we use, computable general equilibrium models, view the economy as a set of interrelated supply chains. And essentially their complexity model. This model divides the economy into 97 sectors, and it's got four regions in it. This is how one adjusts the model to factor in resilience. These are the basic results where we found resilience potential especially high. And one of the reasons is because so much of the production can shift elsewhere in the economy. So you get a lot of negative numbers with all resilience adjustments. You still wind up with a positive impact on the economy outside of the Los Angeles area because production has shifted there. And so it does make a difference as to whether you're just isolating the region or the nation as a whole. So I don't think I need to summarize that. I'd rather spend my last couple of minutes on conclusions and future research. So essentially, economic consequence analysis is a mature and tested economic loss estimation approach. We found resilience is a powerful loss reduction tool. Behavioral overreactions can greatly exacerbate losses. There are two other aspects here that I haven't talked about today, but are there in my research, and I think I mentioned some of them in my the papers I put in the references, and I'm happy to entertain questions on those relating to business interruption insurance and relocation decisions. So as far as future research, a lot of us are coming in increased realization, and COVID-19 is dramatizing this, the complications associated with compound or cascading disasters, where we recently had a hurricane in the midst of the pandemic. Another thing about improving resilience is implementing obstacles to implementing it. And finally, one of the best ways to overcome behavioral overreactions is to improve risk communication to quell fear. It's a very low cost tactic that has the capability of reducing billions of dollars of losses in a major disaster. So with that, I'll just note those various papers that I've cited. The port study I've just mentioned is the first one. There's resilience to cyber attack. The ECAT tool is listed there. And what happened to my screen? But that's fine. Malika probably pulled a fast one on me, I don't know. But anyway, if you want to see the business resilience calculator, just look at resiliencecalculator.com, and it works best on Google Chrome. Okay, that's my presentation.
Adam, thank you so much. That gave us a whole lot to think about. And I think we can all feel it right now. It's so relevant living through COVID. So I think it's a great time to talk about business disruption when it's something that is not just conceptual, but we can all, we've now experienced. However, not something that all models or plans take into account. So this is really helpful. I didn't pull a fast one on you. You should be able to go backwards in your slides if you want to. You have to pull them up to answer a question.
Okay, it was odd that it just, I thought that was the cyber version of the old-fashioned vaudeville hook or something.
No.
But anyway.
There are lots of questions in the Q&A, so if you need a drink of water or anything, go ahead. But
I just got it, so I'm good.
Okay.
How should we? I recall you had a protocol, and I can't recall what it is, but you're moderating, so however you want to do this.
Great. Yeah, I'll ask you the question so I can follow that, and you can focus on your answer.
Okay.
So our top question right now is about uncertainty and how uncertainty levels are communicated, and how do you believe recovery planning can use the results with consideration of the uncertainties?
Okay. Well, we have factored in uncertainty in the ECAT tool, as I mentioned. We do have the ability in that to factor in uncertainty and display it in terms of giving you a range of estimates or a entire probability distribution. Even in the business resilience calculator, we provide the business using it entire probability distribution of how businesses have in fact fared in terms of, I hope I mentioned that the data input for the business resilience calculator are 2 surveys of Hurricane Harvey and Superstorm Sandy victims. But there's a whole distribution. Not everyone was hit the same way or reacted the same way, so there are distributions there. So uncertainty should be taken into account. COVID-19 is a classic example. We can talk about reopening, but it's not going to happen overnight. There's a lot of uncertainty about how people are going to react. And
how do you best communicate that? It's in the range.
Well, I think I've mentioned how we communicate it in the 2 pieces of software. Communicating that, I think one of the ways I do it, it's not the only way, is scenario analysis, where you make some assumptions. Instead of coming up with a point estimate that's likely to be wrong, we often put together various assumptions which would represent kind of an upper bound, an optimistic view of the reopening, and the various assumptions which would relate to a more pessimistic, and provide that range. And if there are several factors, then we do them one at a time, so you can isolate or decompose the results in terms of individual influential factors.
Great, thank you. Our next question is looking at kind of turning around the metric and saying, the question is, do you think we could recognize a greater adoption of disaster risk reduction through resilience planning if we turn the metric around? So I think that's your resilience metric, and demonstrate the opportunity cost instead of the potential benefit. And I kind of think you've done that in that.
Yeah, well, go ahead, Malika. Go ahead.
No.
All right.
questions for you.
Well, I think we're talking about the same thing. Again, we're doing loss estimation, not just for its own sake, but because the losses represent the potential benefits. So I think many of you are probably familiar with what's known as the 4-to-1 study, the mitigation save study. So I had the honor of leading that as a report to Congress in 2005, where we evaluated 10 years of FEMA's hazard mitigation grant program funding, over $10 billion. And essentially what we did was on a given project, in terms of its mitigation cost, we then evaluated the losses with and without that mitigation, and that represented the benefits. So to get the with and without, you have to do two types of consequences analyses, one with and one without. So I think we're really talking about the same thing, and just looking at both sides of the coin.
Great, and Jennifer, if you want to elaborate in the chat, please do, and we can put more around that question too. But Adam, the next question is kind of regarding the current experience with COVID-19 and the widespread economic impact. So how do we offset the negative behavioral linkages? In a pandemic, relocation isn't a viable option. So the question is, what ways can we support economic resilience during COVID-19?
Well, listen to Dr. Fauci. We can get back to work more readily by wearing masks and practicing good hygiene and social distancing, and knowing that people we work with and go to school with are doing the same thing. But one of the more obvious resilience tactics from an economic standpoint is telework. So telecommuting has been able to offset a large proportion of the potential losses in many sectors. Obviously, it's much more difficult in heavy manufacturing, but many professional and technical services, even education, being able to use the internet or virtual work goes a long way.
Yeah, thanks. So the things we're being told by our experts.
Right.
Now the next one is back kind of looking at the uncertainties again, and Sahara asks, well, the value of your macroeconomic modeling is clear. Presumably the level of uncertainty in the results is high. So based on past events and calibrations, what is the range of uncertainty in the results?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's tough. Well, let me give you an example of the 9/11 study. We had, I mentioned there were 8 studies that did the analysis. 2 of them were basically on some peripheral aspects. We had about 6 that looked at the macro impacts using time series models, large-scale macroeconometric model, conjoined input-output econometric, computable general equilibrium models. And while some people factored in stock market impacts, which are totally off base, because the stock market is not a flow measure, and the stock market downturn it's just sort of paper losses. But if you really get down to the real economy, most of our estimates were between 50 to 125 billion dollars, and we pretty much settled on the 110. And so, the question, it's a judgment call. Is a ratio of uncertainty bound between, let's say, 55 and 120 billion a large range or not? I think it's a good ballpark estimate, especially since a lot of people are coming up with estimates anywhere from 0 to 500 billion or $1 trillion. So I think as we improve this, we will be able to further refine and improve the accuracy. And there is a need to do a combination of backcasting or post audits. And that's one thing economists are not typically don't do, and a lot of professions don't do this, and that is make a projection, have the event happen, and then try to determine from some other way what the impacts were and do a comparison. I think we need to do more of that. But the problem is it's difficult to project or predict a lot of events in anticipation. So that's one of the issues.
Definitely. Thanks. The next question is looking at a really specific metric in your or piece in your models, and that is, the question is, what factors would you include in assessing total consequence for a single family residential home?
Well, that's a good question for a couple of reasons. One is all too often that is ignored because, you know, one of the things about looking at GDP impacts or employment impacts, especially GDP, it represents the value of goods and services sold in the market. And so that doesn't include, well, it does include the value of owner-occupied dwellings or the rents they pay. Those are taken into account, fortunately. What's not taken into account is the inconvenience or trauma in the, you know, which inconvenience being lesser hits and trauma being pretty severe. What's not taken into account are factors like that. And I think there needs to be more incorporation of those considerations. You can't necessarily do them with these models, even though I've wrote a paper about 15 years ago suggesting how one can. But through a lot of side calculations, and I said a lot, that's wrong, just a few side calculations, one can get a good ballpark estimate of that. And those should be factored in to the analysis. And some of my papers actually look at resilience, not only of businesses, but of government agencies and households. So there are a lot of resilience tactics households can use. We've shown how those can be measured, but we haven't totally taken into account household consequences and resilience measurement yet.
Thanks a lot. I think we have time for one more. And the question here is, what is the major difference between conducting business impact analyses and the resilience metric?
Well, the business economic impact analysis is, you know, it's the old term for consequence analysis. And I tend to use consequence analysis to make the distinction because it's this more comprehensive framework. So you do a preliminary estimation of losses without resilience, and then you factor in resilience, and the difference between the bottom line of your initial simulation and the with resilience is the effect of resilience. And so resilience is a way, a strategy for reducing losses, and impact analysis is a tool to measure them. But impacts in general are where you start in terms of some gross measure, you apply resilience, and you get a net measure of losses after resilience. Hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for all that. Thanks for your time today, Adam.
Sure.
That was great. And thanks to the participants too for active engagement and putting your questions forward. I'm going to keep us on track. That will allow for a 5-minute break right now so we can move our eyes and our bodies. So if we can come back, we'll take a 5-minute break. And if you can be back at 1:15, we will continue. So thanks everyone, and see you in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, welcome back. I'm going to take a second until I see Paul appear on his screen. All right. Hope you all got a chance to move around a little bit. Thanks for staying on. To get us going again, Paul Kovacs is going to tell us about the work of his organization and take us through some macroeconomic modeling and a discussion on economic recovery in Canada. So Paul, I will put your slides up. And can you see them?
I've got them. Thank you.
Great. Then go ahead and let me know when I can advance.
Okay, and Malika, again, timing. What am I aiming for?
You are aiming for 15 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. And Adam, that was amazing. Terrific work, and thank you for making the time, Adam, to share that with us. If I start with the first slide, what I intend to do is quickly go through 9 slides. So I don't have very many slides I'm going to talk about, but some of them I'm going to pause a little bit. And I'm going to talk about transformative improvement. When I created my group, I decided to call it the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction because we're not looking at the everyday kind of bad event. We're looking at the really big ones. And we think there's a chance to make a big improvement. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that will come. I was following the questions in the Q&A, and Wes had several questions saying, how can we be specific? Are there specifics? I'm going to talk about a few specifics that I have in mind that I think could be done that could really make things better. And I'll talk about things that I know that I think would work in the Canadian context. And in particular, I've got 3 slides that are mentioned here on the front where I'm going to pause and go through a little bit in more detail. First, how do you reduce existing risk? And I'm going to pause and spend some time and go through some of my thoughts. That's actually the hardest. The second, we've been creating a lot of risk. And so how could we try to reduce how much risk creation is taking place? And third, how recovery can be really powerful as an opportunity to improve resilience. So 3 of my last 4 slides, I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to be specific, going through those particular areas about resilience and how we might do things on a big scale. The final slide I'll do rather quickly is how you pay for it all, do finance. But anyway, so that's what I want to talk about, some specific opportunities to improve resilience in Canada and try to do it, try to look for really big change, transformative type change in the time that I have. So again, thanks. Malika, can you go to this next slide? So our institute's been around for a while. We're coming up almost on 25 years now. And I hope you've come across our work at some point. And we work across a number of hazards, earthquakes, but also climate-related hazards and flooding and other risks. And we're based at Western University. We get about half of our funding from different government agencies, but about half comes from the insurance industry. So we work quite closely with the insurance industry. And I'm quite comfortable chatting about insurance and offering my perspective about what the industry does and why there's some opportunities there will come up in some of my conversation. Part of our international work, I believe, British Columbia is absolutely leading Canada in this space. And those of you on the call, thank you. I mean, you're leading the way. And a part of our job is to try to share what we understand you're doing and why, and tell other people elsewhere in the country you should catch up and do the same things. But also on an international scale, some of the things going on in British Columbia are world-class and leading the way. So feel very proud that some of the work you're doing is really, really outstanding and well done. On to the next slide, please. So part of the introduction that I offered to frame the day, we are seeing an increase in loss and damage resulting from extreme events. And we have to break this trend. It's simply unsustainable and very, very bad. So we need to break the trend. The data available consistently finds that the economics, I'm an economist, Adam's an economist, the economics of doing something here are overwhelming. That's not the problem. The actions required will lead to savings that are many-fold larger. And so the economic story is really good, and the issue goes beyond the economics. How do we change behavior? How do we get improvement? It is my sincere belief that most of the losses that have been experienced, most of the losses that are possible, are preventable. We know what to do, and I'll try to give some specific examples today. And so it's possible to make a very large change, sound economics. We just need to focus on and achieving improvement going forward. Next slide, please. So here's a graphic that I generated, trying to get the total damage that's taken place in Canada. Again, trying to be clear about what Adam was sharing with you and what I have done here. The work of our institute and the work of most of my conversation today is on direct damage. This is damage to buildings, damage to infrastructure, the direct damage part, the physical damage. And this is looking at the total damage in Canada. The large oval at the top shows the 3 really bad events that happened in Canada, with the wildfire in Fort McMurray and the flood in Calgary and the ice storm in Quebec. But beyond that, there's a trend. The trend is rising. The numbers are getting really big. We're not very far away, if this trend continues, to see these extraordinary events that felt like a once-in-a-lifetime event are going to happen every year or two. This is a very uncomfortable trend. Increases is not just inflation and population, but this is a meaningful, large increase. This is why groups like the World Economic Forum are saying this is the biggest risk in the world, and this is the top issue. We need to do better than what we are experiencing. This is the Canadian version of the story. If I move to the next slide, please. One of the problems in Canada is we don't keep very good data on what Adam has been challenging us. If we don't measure this very well, it's really hard to know what's going on. One of the areas where there is some data to work from is, I mentioned that we've been tied to the insurance industry, and they keep track. Every time there's another event, we just had Canada's most damaging hailstorm, and that'll lead to insurance payments of $1.3 billion that happened in June. We follow all of these numbers from the insurance companies in red here for the last 40 years. I'm showing this on a logarithmic scale as opposed to the normal scale we used just in the previous slide. If you look on this on a logarithmic scale and you draw a line through it, you see a pretty clear trend. For 40 years, the numbers are going up and up and up, doubling every 5 to 10 years. And this is not a bad decade. This is a very well-established long-term trend of rising damage occurring across Canada. Using the most consistent database I have access to, which is the payments by insurance companies. And as Adam is challenging us, wouldn't it be great if we look at in a much more broader scale? Absolutely would be. It's just kind of hard to do because the data is not rigorously put together that way. But here's one that's put together on a consistent basis. The numbers are going up and up and up and up and up. And you keep this up and eventually everything's gone. I mean, you just can't allow this to continue. You need to break this trend. If I move on to the next one. Okay, so I have 4 slides that'll wrap up my time here, and I'm going to go a little bit more deliberately, especially over the next 3. So when I think about how you break this trend, one of them is to focus on reducing existing risk. The Sendai framework talked in a very broad framing, but this is one of the parts that was talked about the most. It is my evidence that the largest focus has been and should be on homes. The data we have available to us, homes are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience a loss than commercial risks in terms of physical damage. We need to do better with our homes. We build very good homes in this country, but we're still experiencing losses, in part because we're not taking care of them, etc. So how do we design and build and take care of homes so that they do a better job? It is important to do better on the business side too, and focus on our public infrastructure. When our infrastructure lets us down, the whole system's in trouble. Our particular work at our institute has put more emphasis on homes because we think that's where the largest gap and the greatest opportunity to do better exists. Over on the right here, again, try to be specific. We have put together specific advice for a homeowner that we are trying to encourage local governments to send out to homeowners, or we give it to insurance companies to send out to homeowners, or we put them on our own website. So the homeowner can walk around their own house without any expert help and answer a dozen questions, and they'll know if they have a problem. Simple, straightforward ways to judge whether you are at risk. If you get a big score, you're in trouble. If you get a low score, well done, and you have other things to do that day. But if you get a poor score in terms of risk to your home, then read the rest of the book and it tells you what to do. If you're in an area where you are at risk of basement flooding, put in a backwater valve, have a sump pump, landscape so the water goes away from your home when there's a heavy rain event. We try to give 3 or 4 very specific suggestions of what should be done. One of the things that we try to do, which is always challenging, it's our evidence, because we have a program where we partner with communities and we go across the country and actually fix somebody's house. We're finding that this is not a simple process. There is not one thing that solves everybody's problem. Fixing an existing home depends on when the home was built and where it is, and lots and lots and lots of details. And it's only through experience that you find out what actually needs to be done to a particular home. And so our advice is usually not some small costless thing. It's actually something substantive. It's real effort that's required to make things better. We do find that most homeowners get overwhelmed if you tell them to do 20 things better, but if there was 1 or 2 things that could really make your home better, if you were going to make the effort because you're at risk, what could be done? Much of our focus on reducing existing risk, you try to find who is actually ultimately responsible. And for a lot of the assets, it is the homeowner, it's the business, it is the government, public owner of the public infrastructure. And they're the ones who need to be motivated and need to do a better job managing their risk. If I move to the next slide. When I was in Sendai and we put together the global framework, we were trying to have a long conversation getting ready for this international framing of the problem, and finding and trying to document where is the challenge coming from. And risk creation came up again and again in the conversation, that the traditional focus on reducing existing risk is really important, because there's a lot of us who live in an existing house, not a future house. But how could you make sure that the conversation included focusing on also avoiding creating new risk? This is the role of the planner. In my opinion, the planner is more integrated to the British Columbia conversation than most of this country. The planner is not central to the disaster management conversation in most of Canada, and should be. It's absolutely critical. If there's an area of high risk, you should stop building there and understand why and explain it, and just don't allow adding risk to the community. Communities like Greater Vancouver that are growing so quickly, and much more is to come, do the best to make sure people go into places that are not going to be risky. They're known to be risky, don't go there. And that conversation is further along in British Columbia, but it is still not an easy conversation. And the conversation's further along for flooding, but you get into all the other hazards where there's an opportunity, like landslide, like wildfire, et cetera, where planners can play a big leadership role and need to be viewed and encouraged and welcomed as leaders to manage disaster risk and stop the creation of additional risk. Building codes, same conversation. Building codes, if you build it right at the beginning, you can do way better. There's an enormous opportunity. If you are trying to improve an existing building, some of the things that our research advise are impossible for an existing building, because you'd have to knock lots of things down and the cost gets prohibitive. But if you're starting new, the extra cost to be resilient from the beginning is remarkably low. Huge benefits relative to cost. Yet a very hard conversation in Greater Vancouver, where the cost of a new home is really high. Anything that adds to that cost is a difficult conversation, and to point out that you'll save money later is not still straightforward. But again, because we've been doing this conversation for a long time, We've been trying to find ways to help new builders understand that they can have something they can market to buyers that aren't available to existing homes. The new home costs more, but you get something that just isn't possible in a new home because you put it in from the start. Anyway, there's conversations about planning and about infrastructures, and again, public infrastructure, getting it right. We as a country are going to spend, or have spent, billions of dollars, are going to spend billions more on our public infrastructure. And when we put it in right, for things like climate change, for sea level rise, for all kinds of things that are known from the science are coming. And when we put that infrastructure in place, we must respect the use of public funds and get it right, and use science to do that properly. Let's not create risk unnecessarily, because the science, the knowledge exists to do a better job. If I move on to the next slide. One of the areas that is increasingly being talked about is Build Back Better. I had an opportunity after the SENDA agreement was put together to sit with a number of policymakers and talk about how to implement Sendai and how science could inform and support those keen on achieving the 4 goals set out, because they embrace and move with it. The most controversial was Build Back Better. Some decision makers in the public sector and the private sector heard Build Back Better as saying, spend more money than you've got available, and money's not easy to find. I'm not happy about you telling me to spend more. Where the heck is that going to come from? And Build Back Better was also seen as a criticism, saying, well, whatever we've been doing for the last time must have been bad. You're telling me to tell other people they're not very good at what they do? Build Back Better was not an easy conversation, actually, relative to a conversation about, yeah, we need to better understand risk, of course. We need to invest in resilience, of course. We need better governance, of course. Build Back Better was an interesting conversation. But as we continued the conversation, it became a discussion about planning for resilience and recovery. And that was embraced. This was an acknowledgement of what has shown up in decades of work, that when something terrible happens, there is a window right afterward where people want things better. They have different definitions of better, but they want things better. They don't want to have that risk come back again. It's a short window, like a year or year and a half, and they want to act. But if you haven't planned, if you don't know in advance what you mean by better and specifically what you'll do, you're going to miss that window. We had communities like Fort McMurray. 90% of the homes that burned down in the Waterways neighborhood were in the floodplain, and they decided to build them back. I mean, we could have done better, and the money was there to build the homes, and the land was there on the top of the hill, but we put them back where they were, and we missed an opportunity to do better. And there are examples. This image here, on the right at the bottom, is High River in 2013. It had a terrible flood, and High River is a community that's had flood regularly. But they knew what they wanted to do, and after that flood in 2013, within 5 years, they built it back better, the image on the left, the same community 5 years later. And the mayor describes High River as the most flood-prepared community in Canada. That was not true in 2013, and that's what the mayor believes today, that they have committed, worked to build the community back better than it was before, and they are ready for future flooding, future extreme rainfall and river flow. It is possible to make transformative change in recovery, like High River, but it requires planning before the event. And in some communities like lower mainland of British Columbia, we know what some of those big events are, like a Fraser flood or a huge earthquake. We know what those events are, and we can plan for what a recovery, a perfect recovery, a better recovery would look like from those events. And again, this is one of the areas where many on this call, many in British Columbia, are actually leading the way. There's a conversation that's much more advanced in British Columbia. I encourage you to go further, but it's more advanced in British Columbia on what this really means. Build Back Better is not just spend more money. Build Back Better is actually to plan that a recovery can make you more resilient and better. Move to the last slide. How do you pay for all of this? So one of the ways to pay for this is in 1970, the government of Canada, responding to the Vancouver flooding, responding to the Fraser flooding, responding to flooding in Ontario and Manitoba, put together the Disaster Financial Assistance Program. For more than a decade now, that program says, and we'll throw in an extra 15%. If you need to put things back, here's more money so you can put it back better. The financing has been in place for public response for a long period of time. Last time I checked, nobody had applied for it. Nobody collected any money. So we need to fix a number of things to make it work, and I welcome that longer conversation. But there is a program in place in Canada based on some of the experience in the United States, so that when we recover, there is explicit federal assistance that is designed to be available to help pay for recovery. Most of the Disaster Financial Assistance Program has focused on municipal infrastructure damaged by storms. And this would be sort of a top-up if municipal infrastructure could be put back better. And I anticipate perhaps one of the reasons why few municipalities or provinces, sorry, have applied for the funding is because the municipalities didn't have a plan about what they would do if they were given federal funding to put things back better. And a commitment to plan in advance about recovery would have a huge impact, I think. And there is a specific place to go and ask for that money and to make things better. I work with insurance companies. Insurance companies are really motivated to try to have customers who don't have risk or reduce their risk or take action to reduce their risk. Over time, I have watched insurance companies change the way they price. If you have somebody with lower risk, the price goes down. If somebody with higher risk, the price goes up. The insurance companies, I think the lenders, the credit unions and banks and others are figuring out that it really helps to allow them to make money and do well, to have customers that understand and do something about their risk. I'm seeing more of that as building into the kind of processes that the financial sector is involved in. Most of the payments that go to homeowners and to building owners comes from the private sector. Disaster assistance is available for some uninsured risk, but it's the lion's share of the assistance comes through the financial sector. But at the end of the day, it's your home. It's your business, and the decision about doing something for resilience goes back to that particular property owner. I think there's a large unrealized opportunity for the public sector to collaborate with the private sector and design programs to inform and to perhaps offer some financial incentives to property owners to do more to reduce risk. And anybody who would like to follow through on specifics, I'd love to sit down and talk with them about what a specific program would look like. But I think there is direct funding for public assets to build back and to build more resilient. And there are incentives that can be offered from private sector, but also from a collaboration with the public sector that could better inform and motivate owners going forward. So Malika, I hope I've behaved myself on timing. My main opportunity today was to build on an outstanding keynote by Adam to talk about what this means in the Canadian context. I'm focused a little bit on the area that I know best, which is on the direct risks that are taking place. I think the trends that have been occurring for 40 years, probably longer, but 40 years where I've got data, need to stop. We need to break it. This is not something that can be allowed to continue. The science, the specifics does exist to break this trend. And I look at it specifically what we can do in terms of what you do for existing risk, how you can stop creating new risk, and how, when a recovery occurs, you can put things back better. Across that, I think there's a great opportunity not only for incremental change, but for transformative change so that the outcome for the next 40 years is much better than what we've been experiencing for the last period. So thank you, Malika, for the opportunity to share that.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thanks for that. That was really, I think, helpful and specific for the Canadian context too. And I'll put a plug in for you. For those who don't know your website too, it's iclr.org, and all the resources you showed and a whole lot more are there. I also kind of on the in the vein of web resources wanted to point out, because this is a macroeconomic session, that Air Worldwide study commissioned by the Insurance Bureau of Canada that Adam referenced is available online too, as is, I think, a really important analysis put out by the C.D. Howe Institute from Nicolas Lepin is available online too. So a Google search will get you a long way with those. So thank you, Paul. That was great. And I'll let people know again, if, and I see some people are beginning to put questions in chat, continue to do that. But we'll follow that up with Dan Oprescu, the Director of Risk Surveillance with the BC Financial Services Authority, is also with us today. Now, Dan is a physicist by training and a financial risk manager by experience, and his organization's mandate is focused on the stability of the BC financial system. And as financial consequences of non-financial risks such as climate, cyber, and pandemics gain importance, the work of his team and the BC Financial Services Authority is leading to more and more collaboration with non-traditional partners like many of us and local governments, academia, and industries outside finance. Their latest endeavor is modeling the financial viability under severe stresses such as COVID-19 or a major earthquake in Vancouver. So I see, Dan, you're unmuted. Great. Welcome and thanks for being here. And please go ahead and provide any remarks you might have relative to the topic.
Thanks very much, Malaika. I hope everyone can hear me. And I will start with thanking Adam and Paul for very impressive presentations, setting a very high bar for any subsequent interventions such as mine. I only have 5 minutes and I will use them to address 3 points. First, why would the financial services regulator look at resilience? The second point is, how would we look at resilience? And the third is, what are we doing about it? Let's start at the top. Recent trends and regime changes in which we include climate, interest rates that have gone very low, the pandemic, property prices that keep going up, and they've taken off for the past couple of decades in Canada. These trends and regime changes elevate the importance of non-financial risks to financial institutions such as banks, credit unions, and insurance companies, but also to financial policymakers and financial regulators such as us. So how are we looking, how's the financial regulator looking at resilience in the face of natural disasters? Adam already alluded to that in his presentation. There's the short-term view immediately post-disaster. And in financial terms, it's important that the payment systems and the liquidity, financial liquidity in the system are preserved. Because everything costs money, even after a disaster and recovering from a disaster, everything costs money. And it's important that everybody, all consumers, industries, all entities have the same full access to payments and liquidity, funds. And that's an important precondition, let's say, for post-disaster work. Then the long-term view, which I could say is pre-disaster, is about the viability and prosperity of institutions, individuals, and societies. In that respect, loss reduction expenses, Paul has made a very good point on that. They are financial aspects, and because they are financial institutions engage with them, and the financial regulator needs to engage with them as well. In that respect, our work in financial services regulation complements Adam's work that's been presented earlier, and probably most of the work by the, if I could use the word, the disaster recovery community. It is assumed that that work has a fully functional financial system at its disposal, that lenders can continue to lend, insurers are there to make payouts on policies, and payment systems are fully functional, so there's no delay in transfer of funds. With this, what are we doing about this? What's the BC Financial Services Regulator doing about this? We've been working recently with a number of stakeholders, non-traditional for us. So normally we wouldn't talk very much to engineers or scientists, but we started this, and the purpose is to apportion potential losses to loss bearers. Again, Paul made a very good presentation on how losses can be insured and what kind of losses can be expected after disasters. But insurers are not the only loss bearers. Through the deductible of each insurance policy, the policyholders, the homeowner or the business that buys insurance still has a residual risk. There is a residual loss that is not insured, and of course, not everybody is insured. And it's important to point that out because, for example, earthquake insurance penetration in BC is very good. Say 50%. Is 50% good? Well, if we compare with Quebec, where the penetration rate is 1 to 2%, that's a lot better. It may be surprising, but this is what it is, which means that 95+% of Quebec homeowners don't carry earthquake insurance, although one of the scenarios mentioned even today that of a major disaster in Canada is an earthquake in Quebec affecting Montreal and the St. Lawrence Valley. So other loss bearers would be individual industries, of course insurance companies, but also lenders. Damage to property that secures mortgages would represent a loss to the lenders. And governments of all levels have their own part to play, and they can be viewed even as loss bearer of last resort. The purpose of our endeavor is to enable financial planning for disaster resilience. So those expenses that come upfront to reduce disaster losses, and also to ensure that through this exercise of estimating losses, no loss bearer gets overwhelmed in the aftermath of a disaster. And we think this is important because we see how when the COVID pandemic hit, all levels of governments came to the aid of individuals and businesses. But that creates huge commitments, much higher than previously expected. So this exercise in estimating potential losses should help everyone plan better from a financial point of view, and secure the situation from a financial point of view post-disaster. And that was my 5 minutes up.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you so much. I think you may have generated questions there. That was interesting. And while you were talking, I see among the attendees too, we have Richard Bilodeau from the Department of Finance, and he has a comment. So Richard, if you can unmute, welcome. And please go ahead and introduce yourself, the role of your organization, and any words you have to add to the conversation about the work of your group.
Great, thank you, Malika, and thank you, Paul and Dan and Adam for those presentations. They're quite interesting. And so my name is Richard Bilodeau. I'm the Director General of the Financial Institutions Division within the Financial Sector Policy Branch of the Department of Finance. One of the teams that I lead focuses on framework policy, and one of the projects that we've been working on over the last, I would say, 18 months has been looking at whether businesses and governments and Canadians are financially prepared for a what we would call an extreme earthquake event, the famous 1 in 500 year event. We know that just from our work generally that P&C insurance companies are fairly well, from a prudential perspective, ready for what we would refer to as a more typical event. But looking at whether or not that 1 in 500 year is taken care of. This really came out of work that we did when we reviewed the financial statutes 2 years ago, and some concerns from the P&C industry that there were some issues that would need to be looked at from a financial stability perspective, and whether or not everybody was ready to deal with this. And so the work that we've done over the last year has really focused on broadening our understanding. We contracted with a number of experts. We've had a lot of conversations with the industry, particularly IBC, and all of that work culminated in an announcement in July in the financial snapshot from the Minister of Finance, in announcing that we would develop insurance-based strategies to address broader natural disasters, and specifically earthquakes, but also including the broader disasters that could be caused by or related to climate change over the next few years, as Paul has shown. When you look at that trend and increasing value of losses, if climate change keeps getting worse, that trend's not going to reverse anytime soon. And so really looking to not just earthquake, but all climate related events, and figuring out and determining where the protection gaps exist and what role the federal government can play in narrowing that gap. We're not going to do this alone. We've been talking to lots of our provincial partners. We have a forum where we share a lot of information that we've, until COVID anyways, we're meeting as often as we could. And so we're going to re-engage with that group fairly soon. And we'll be rolling out our work plan and engaging in it with the industry and academics, and hopefully gain a lot more access to data that is so elusive, as Paul pointed out, but it is going to inform a lot of the work that we're doing. We're also going to support public safety as they do their work on flood. That was announced as well in the fiscal snapshot. So we'll be working with our colleagues there and helping them do their analysis and their work. So I'm not going to take up any more time, just conscious of time. I'm happy to take questions, also happy to have anybody reach out offline if they want to have further discussions.
Thanks so much, Dan. That's great, helpful, and it'll be interesting to follow along as that rolls out. So thanks, Richard. Yeah, very interesting, and we're really happy you were able to join us today. In the short time we have left, we'll turn to a quick Q&A. We might have time for just a couple questions. I noticed too that Paul answered a question in the chat regarding impact data and collection thereof, that there is an active initiative with his organization to do that. If I go to the top question in the Q&A right now, and I'm gonna guess this is probably directed towards Adam, but I'll invite anyone to comment. It's a question on, can you comment on some of the incentives that work against disaster resilience? For example, disaster relief payments, insurance, property value, etc.
Well, that's one of the thorniest issues in all of disaster risk management. People who suffer a disaster are really in dire need, but at the same time, bailing them out is a disincentive for them to protect themselves. So that's an age-old problem. So I completed a study about 2 years ago for FEMA in which they were proposing a disaster deductible credit system. And that was, rather than FEMA being first payer, there would be a deductible for their public assistance program that would be based on a combination of the risk for individual states and the fiscal capacity of these states. And they had it was a pretty good idea because they matched it with a credit system, and that was that, well, you might have a deductible of $20 million on any single disaster, just like you've got a deductible on your auto insurance to avoid the moral hazard issue that I just mentioned. If you spent money on mitigation, that can be applied to offset the deductible. That's where the credit comes from. So if you spent 20 million on mitigation, then that would reduce it. And we wrote a broader paper where we talked about spending it not just on pre-event mitigation, but also on property damage pre-event mitigation for life safety, and also resilience tactics like the one I mentioned. Unfortunately, the states, there were so many negative comments and much feedback from the states that they held up in moving it forward. But I think some innovative approaches would be very good. Another thing is that, you know, one of the most effective ways to reduce loss, especially perpetual losses, and avoid this is buyouts of people in floodplains and other hazard zones. In our 4-to-1 study, we found that one of the most cost-effective of all approaches.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we have an example of that recently in BC with the Grand Forks floods, where it's rare, but there were some buyouts. Paul, did you want to elaborate at all on the question regarding data collection?
I'd be glad to. And quickly on the incentives too. For the private insurance companies, they really are motivated to tie the terms and the price they offered to homeowners and to businesses in Canada to the risk. So if you have a homeowner with high risk, then they charge more. And if you have a homeowner with low risk, they charge less. What the insurance companies have not been very good at are explaining it all. And so not all of them say to you, hey, if you did this one change, I'll change your price by this amount, and make it clear. So much of it's going on. And some of the companies are doing that. Some are more open about that than others. Anyway, on the data side, the Government of Canada, through the Canadian Disaster Database, has an online searchable database offered by Public Safety Canada. It boldly goes back to the year 1900. If anybody uses data before 1980, they're usually criticized if you put it in a publication or whatever, because the data before 1980 is really bad. But the data since 1980 is pretty good. And so there's an online searchable database by event where you can get a sense of what the impacts have been. For the insurance industry, there's a pretty rigorous process that's run by a private company called Cat IQ. If you'd like that data, you have to pay for it. As an academic researcher, we often find that we can work with various people, and we have access to all of that. So another way to get access to that can be to work with a group like us. And I have access to 4 or 5 other databases that are not as well known and maybe not as complete, but sometimes you can pick across them and find out what's there. What's common through most of the databases that I'm familiar with is they focus almost exclusively on physical direct damage. And the broader presentation by Adam, the broader analysis is really powerful and important, but you're going to have to be brave to complete that. And it's not necessarily going to be handed to you from somebody's thoughtful database. But if you are looking for a foundation to start by looking at physical direct damage, that's a very good place to start. It's a huge issue, and a lot of people motivated, decision makers are motivated by avoiding or understanding physical direct damage. So the data is a little bit better there, and it's a place to start.
Thanks a lot, Paul. And I was hoping that we'd have time for more questions and perhaps some more comments from all of you, but in the name of ending on time, thanks so much, Paul, Adam, Dan, and Richard for participating today, for providing insight into your work, your resources, your models. That was wonderful. So thanks also to the participants for your active engagement and questions. I'd also like to thank the sponsors of our team. And on that note, I will share my screen and show you who it is that I'm talking about there. Thanks to the organizing team as well. And I hope you'll join us for future Understanding Risk BC sessions. The next one is September 9th, and it will feature Murray Journey talking about insights gained from disaster risk and recovery modeling in the Lower Mainland, looking specifically at flood and seismic risks with the latest models. So you can have a look at the urbc.ca website for more information. Also, we'll now enable all participants to speak. So if you'd like, please, I invite you to unmute yourself so you can say hellos, goodbyes, and offer thanks to the speakers. But on that, it is noon here, and thanks so much for joining us. And I hope to see you all next time.
Thank you.